If you're studying A-level philosophy or religious studies and ethics, subscribe. I'm covering the entire course on this channel. Here we look at Jeremy Bentham's Hedonic calculus, a guide to measuring pleasure and pain in ethical decision making, and we're going to hone in on this aspect of utilitarianism. Bentham believed that moral decisions should not rely simply on tradition, religious authority, or personal intuition. Instead, he argued ethics should be grounded in reason and evidence. His bold idea was that pleasure and pain could actually be measured and compared, allowing us to determine which actions are morally right. Now, this method became known as the hedonic calculus, a systematic way of evaluating the amount of happiness or suffering produced by different actions. Bentham believed that if we could calculate pleasure and pain properly, we could make ethical decisions in a more objective and rational way. So who was Jeremy Bentham? Jeremy was an English philosopher and social reformer born in 1748. He's best known as the founder of classical utilitarianism, the ethical theory that actions are right if they promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Bentham was also a remarkably unusual character. As a child, he was something of a prodigy, reportedly reading serious philosophical texts at a very young age. Something all good young philosophers should do. He believed that ethics should be based on reason rather than religion or tradition, and that was quite radical for the 18th century. He was also deeply involved in social reform. He argued for prison reform, legal reform, and even early forms of animal rights. In fact, he famously wrote, when considering animals, the important question is not can they reason or can they speak, but can they suffer? His goal was to develop a method that could make morality measurable and objective, and that ambition led him to create the hedonic calculus. And so we have the principle of utility sitting at the heart of utilitarianism. And this is known as the greatest happiness principle. This states that actions are right if they promote happiness and wrong if they promote the opposite of happiness. In other words, morality should focus on maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. And this makes utilitarianism a form of consequentialist ethics. And that's because the morality of an action depends entirely on its consequences rather than its intentions or rules. And so Bentham took a quantitative approach to pleasure. He believed that pleasure and pain could be measured and compared much like we measure weight or distance. He also believed that pleasure and pain govern all human behaviour. According to Bentham, we're constantly seeking pleasure and constantly avoiding suffering, whether we realise that or not. And so the principle of utility therefore asks us to step back from all of this and ask a simple question. Which action produces the greatest happiness overall? So what was the purpose of this specific aspect of his principle, known as the hedonic calculus? Well, he developed this as a practical method for calculating pleasure and pain. He wanted ethics to be objective and systematic rather than based on personal feelings. One purpose is to make ethics more objective. So instead of relying on our instinct or our emotion, we evaluate our actions according to a clear set of criteria. He also aimed to remove personal bias. And so by applying the same criteria to every situation, Bentham hoped that we could make moral decisions more fairly. But it also allowed us to compare different actions. If we're choosing between two options, we can analyse the consequence and determine which one produces more happiness. Perhaps more importantly, Bentham believed the approach promoted democracy. He famously argued that each person counts for one and nobody counts for more than one. And this means that everyone's happiness matters equally, regardless of their wealth, their power, or their social status. And so to do this, he came up with 7 criteria for the hedonic calculus to evaluate pleasure and pain. And these help us analyze different aspects of happiness. Number 1, intensity. How strong the pleasure or pain is. Number 2, the duration. How long the pleasure lasts. Number 3, certainty. How likely the pleasure is to occur. Number 4, propinquity. How soon the pleasure will happen. Number 5, fecundity. Will the pleasure lead to more pleasure in the future? Number 6, purity. Will the pleasure be followed by pain? And number 7, extent. How many people are going to be affected? And so together, these 7 factors form Bentham's attempt to calculate happiness systematically. Well, let's apply the hedonic calculus to a practical example. Imagine a simple decision. Should you spend £50 on a concert ticket or donate the money to charity? Well, if you go to the concert, the intensity of the pleasure may be very high. You enjoy the music, the atmosphere, the experience. But the duration is limited. It's only going to last maybe, let's say, 3 hours. You look at how certain it is. It's very likely that you're going to experience a lot of pleasure. And it's going to happen soon, let's say next week. And it could inspire creativity. There could be more pleasure that comes as a consequence of this. You might have a little bit of guilt afterwards, thinking, oh, I could have spent that money in a different way. And the extent of this impact is that it only really affects you. Now, let's say you choose to give the money to charity instead. Well, you're going to have some moderate pleasure because you're going to feel somewhat good. You're going to see, or you may not see, but you can assume there's a long-lasting impact to your donation. There's a certain percentage that is likely to help a certain number of people. You may not actually see the benefit yourself, or others may not feel the benefit of your giving until a bit further down the line. But it will create further good. It will create some good feelings for you, and it will create some good, hopefully, for the people that you give the money to. And again, that pure positive feeling you're going to get from giving. And the extent of your charitable donation is that it will affect potentially many people. And so Bentham would argue that the morally right choice is the one that produces the greatest happiness overall, even if your personal pleasure is smaller. And so in this case, he probably would say donating to charity produces greater overall happiness due to the higher extent, the duration, the fecundity, despite the lower intensity of personal pleasure. So let's look at some strengths of his approach. First, it is democratic. Everyone's happiness counts equally, regardless of who they are. 2, it provides an objective method for ethical decision-making. Instead of relying purely on your emotion or on tradition, we can evaluate actions systematically. And it's practical. Utilitarian reasoning often is used in real-world situations. We see it today in healthcare policy, legal reform, and public spending decisions by governments. And finally, it's very forward-thinking. Rather than focusing on rigid rules, which sometimes religion will propagate, it focuses on the consequences of actions and the real impact that they have on people's lives. Well, what are some of the criticisms of the hedonic calculus? Despite its strengths, it's been heavily criticized. And one problem is that pleasure and pain are subjective experiences. What feels extremely pleasurable to one person may feel much less significant to someone else. Can we really mathematically calculate feelings? And it's also therefore impractical. Think about how time-consuming it would be in an urgent situation like a medical emergency. There's no time to carefully calculate 7 different factors when you're faced with a critical issue. There's also the tyranny of the majority. Could justify, if you do this, harming minorities because it brings pleasure to the majority. So you end up with minorities potentially being persecuted, being discriminated. So it could justify harmful actions. It ignores the quality of the pleasure because it treats all pleasures as equal. So reading poetry, playing a video game, they're all given the same moral weight. And it is very difficult for you to predict the consequences. We can't know with any certainty what those long-term outcomes of the actions are that we take today. And so as a consequence of this, many later philosophers have challenged Bentham's hedonic calculus and utilitarian principle. One of those was John Stuart Mill. When we focus on Jeremy Bentham, he believed that pleasures differ only in quantity, meaning the amount of pleasure that is produced. Whereas Mill disagreed and argued that pleasures differ in quality. So, for example, Mill believed that intellectual and moral pleasures are superior to physical pleasures. Bentham's approach has sometimes been summarized with the phrase, "pushpin is as good as poetry." That suggests simple pleasures are just as valuable as intellectual ones. But Mill famously rejected this idea, and he argued by saying it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Now, this debate between Bentham and Mill became one of the central discussions in utilitarian ethics. So let's think about your exams using the hedonic calculus. For A-level religious studies, understanding Bentham's hedonic calculus is extremely important. So in essays, here's some top tips. You need to begin by defining key terms accurately. So include the principle of utility, consequentialism, the hedonic calculus in your introduction. You need to demonstrate how the 7 criteria can be applied to real ethical issues like euthanasia, abortion, business ethics. You need to evaluate in some of your essays, discussing both the democratic appeal of Bentham's theory and its practical limitations. You need to be able to compare Bentham with Mill and other theories, such as Kant with his deontological ethics. And you can show how utilitarianism differs from other ethical approaches. And you need to use scholarly language. If you can understand both the mechanics and the criticisms of the hedonic calculus, this will allow you to construct stronger, more balanced essays. And don't forget, Bentham's hedonic calculus remains influential in modern ethics, and particularly in medical ethics, law, and public policy.